All right, we're going to talk fascism again. Now, we covered off the topic, I know, a few episodes back with the Turkish journalist and political exile Ece Timurkaren. But there is a lot more that needs to be unpacked with this very existential and very urgent topic. Although I've got to say it's doing some shocking stuff with my social media algorithms, which is precisely why we do, in fact, need to be talking about this subject now, urgently, and while we still can. Now, part of what authoritarianism has always done throughout history, over and over, is not just scare the masses, you and I, but also overwhelm us into this numb acquiescence and numb silence. So I have always felt that step one for all of us wanting to resist and to insist we really can do better than living in a society that bans protests, that terrorizes others, that tolerates a president that posts memes of themselves dressed as Jesus. I've always felt that what we need to be doing first is to understand what is going on so that we can get it. And so our nervous systems and our cognitive functions can then relax a little instead of being bound up in the overwhelm and the bamboozlement and the crazy making stuff, so that we can then open up and move forward into productive human agency. Now, my guest today is Dr. Ruth Ben-Ghiat, and her 2020 New York Times bestselling book, Strongmen, has served as a tool in many podcast, media, and everyday discussions for a number of years now for understanding what has happened to democracy, which, as we covered in previous episodes, has dropped to a point where only 7% of the global population now lives in a liberal democracy. Now, Ruth is an American history professor at New York University and political commentator with an expertise in fascism and authoritarian leaders. And she publishes this wonderful Substack newsletter, Lucid, and I suggest you go and subscribe to it. I'll put a link in the show notes. It's a newsletter on threats to democracy, and she's currently writing her next book about resistance. It's called Resisting Autocracy, What History Teaches About Fighting Back, and that should be coming out next year, I believe. Now, resistance is what I'll be talking about with Ruth in today's podcast, which is what I'll be talking about with Ruth in today's episode. How to resist the current fascist creep and how to push through to the other morally recalibrated side, to the what comes next that I keep referencing in this series. Now, seriously, over and over again, the same themes tend to come up in this series, and that is this kind of need for humanity to rise up into a very human homecoming with the opportunity that is definitely there for fresh direction. And as my guests all seem to sense, what we're really moving towards is creating a what comes next with a freshness. It's not about reinventing anything new as such, but it is about, as Ruth calls it, a values renaissance. So this chat is actually strangely enlivening. Ruth makes the point that authoritarians actually eventually do themselves in. She calls it autocratic backfiring. She also highlights that some of the stuff that we're already doing, like boycotting Amazon, boycotting Spotify for its associations with ICE, and so on, she calls it elite defection. This is also precisely what we need to be doing right now. And she agrees with what every guest on this series so far has said. Change is not going to come from the top down, so we don't have to wait for it. It's going to be an emergent, natural human process. It will entail a rising into something, into our true humanity, rather than some kind of descent into something terrible. Now, once you've listened to this episode, please join Ruth and I over in the comments at my Substack. That's sarahwilson.substack.com, and I'll put the link in the show notes. You can also watch this in video format on YouTube, so subscribe over there. And keeping with the message that's coming up through all these conversations, we do need to get as many people as possible educated, aware of what is going on so that they can then best respond in their most human way. So please share this episode with everyone you know. Let's now meet Ruth Ben-Ghiat. Ruth, welcome to Wild. I'm a big fan of your work.
Thank you. Likewise.
Well, look, we were going to talk, I don't know if you recall, several years ago when your book Strongman came out, and I don't know what happened. I think you were busy, you were on a tour, and it sort of went by the wayside. But you've been pretty busy since. I mean, you're a regular on all kinds of podcasts and TV shows and so on, talking about the big strong man in all our lives, Trump.
Mm-hmm. It's been very strange to see things happening that I have predicted. And also, I mean, Trump 1.0 was in my book Strongmen, which was written during his first term. But this kind of process I call autocratic backfire, which has afflicted others and led to their demise. And now when autocrats, they think they have all the answers, they become grandiose, they have sycophants around them, nobody tells them the truth. And then they do stupid things. They have policies that create large discontent at home. But instead of course correcting, they double down. And then they go into wars without adequate preparation because of said sycophants and incompetence. And we're in the middle of this now in the US, and it's just kind of crazy to see this unfolding literally by the book.
I know, it's funny. A couple of years ago, I interviewed Margaret Atwood, and it was right sort of during the Me Too. It was after the Me Too thing, but I said, "Oh, are you tempted to sort of say I told you so? Is there any kind of smugness that you allow yourself?" And she sent me a photo of herself in her garden holding a mug that said "I told you so" on the front of it. But yeah, it's similarly, I've just written a book about sort of complex systems collapse, and everything that I wrote about is being brought forward. The timelines have just been brought forward, which is how complex systems often go. You can't predict these things. And in fact, once they start, they really do tend to escalate. But can you just give a bit of an elevator pitch on the strongman thesis, just for anybody who's not aware of it?
Yeah, what I tried to do in the book is look at these tools of rule that these autocrats use. And the strongman, I kind of isolated a kind of subset of authoritarians who use machismo quite consciously and actively as part of their kind of tools, along with corruption and violence and propaganda. And the machismo is very important because it's part of their personality cult. And the rules of personality cults have not changed for a century. It's quite amazing. Of course, the media that they use to popularize these cults is obviously different, but has to be a man of the people, so relatable, seems authentic, right? So Modi's very good at that. Now the newest arrival is Bukele. He's one of the younger ones. He's very good at that. But they have to also be a man above all other men. And so there's this hyper-masculinity, this kind of aggressive masculinity that's very important to the machismo. And you see how it feeds into the violence because they advocate use of force. You don't have to ask consent in parliament or in the bedroom. So all of that. So I tried to kind of go over a century and educate people on the way that this works and how all these tools are kind of interlinked.
At the same time, there's this machismo going on, but they're also really frail. There's this fragility and victimhood, which is so bizarre.
One of the things that attracts and makes people curious about these strongmen is they are a massive contradictions. And it's been this way since Mussolini. So they are both the aggressive brute. Mussolini was a serial rapist, but they're the victims. So they're the aggressor and they're also the victim. They always have to be the victim. Either they're, being victimized by kind of foreign powers, or the whole country's been victimized. So there's a whole ideology of Chinese victimization by the West or Russian victimization by the West. And then they're also they're very authentic, and yet they are very savvy with media. They're very artificial. They're about artifice. And so there's just all these contradictions in their personalities that they're always the same. Like Erdogan in Turkey, he's able to cry on command on camera. And so he seems, and this kind of vulnerability, it gets people to feel protective. And you see quotes from people who are fans of Trump and you have the same quotes over years of people go to his rallies and he's playing the victim and they say, I just feel so protective of him. He's been through so much.
Oh, the whole thing of wearing
news,
the ear thing, the bandage on the ear,
yes.
And particularly women. It was also men, but it was particularly women just immediately came out in sympathy. And it makes me think, Ruth, like, is it a way of playing to the female voter to sort of play the hard done by man that needs to be nurtured, while also being the strong man who's going to be protected? And I suppose what it also does is accentuates the us versus them.
Totally.
I've got this wave of enemies. It's the same enemies that are going after you, by the way. They've come after me and we've all got to rally together.
And Trump, being a really smart propagandist, actually said this. He said, they're going after you and I'm just standing in the way. And so he makes himself the martyr on behalf of the people. Another person who played this very well was Bolsonaro in Brazil. So Bolsonaro had been stabbed during his initial presidential campaign. And so periodically he had to go to the hospital while he was in office for checks. So normally heads of state would go into the hospital for checks. They're not making a big public spectacle out of this. Well, Bolsonaro, he would live stream with his hospital gown on, but it would be like slightly off so you could see part of his chest. And you could see he was hooked up to monitors. And he would live stream while he was in the hospital. And he did this many times. And so he was being vulnerable and also saying, look, I took the blow for you. I was stabbed for you and I'm still having to, have the effects of it. And I'm still there for you. So they each do it in their own way, but they do the same thing, and it's incredibly effective. And women do, in fact, respond really well to this. And that's one of the mysteries for some people is why, from Mussolini forward, with Putin with his babushka women, as they were called, why do leaders who take female rights away are sometimes beloved by women? That's one of the paradoxes.
Now, this is a pattern that you've picked up on and reported on from Mussolini until the present moment. But is it a type of man? Is it a sort of a schism in the gene pool and out erupts Trump and Mussolini and so on? Or, I guess it's a question of does power corrupt or, the other way around? Is it a type that just emerges in these vulnerable moments? They just happen to be sort of brought forward? Or do they become this way because they see the opportunity?
It's both. And you stated the both sides very well. So there are what my research showed is that there are certain times where people are discontent and they want a new type of politician. And very tellingly, it's often when societies have been through a lot of social progress. It could be workers' rights, it could be gender equity, it could be racial emancipation, more pluralism, whatever it is. It makes some people in the Euro-American context, it's white males, feel like they're losing something. And so that's going on. And then these strongmen types, it's really interesting that many of them have a background in either media, like Trump comes from TV, Berlusconi came from TV, some are journalists. Mobutu, Mussolini is a journalist. Yeah. Bukele worked in advertising, very interesting. And so they read the marketplace and they kind of see what the openings are. And then because they don't have any morals, they kind of make themselves to be the product people are seeking for, which is super interesting. So it's a meeting of circumstance and personality, but then they shape their message and they're even their like physical beings. They kind of mold it to fit what they think is going to let them get ahead.
Yeah. And it's interesting because we're also involved in this because it happens at a time when there's sort of some, as you say, some kind of upheaval, generally to do with some minority or, like women achieving some kind of rights at some point. It threatens the male ego, but we in many ways also are part of this because we enable it. We simultaneously lose trust in democratic values. We start to criticize the media, we criticize government. Rather than try to improve it or engage in it more, we tend to extract ourselves and we look for somebody who can come along with an easy answer. So it's a two-way thing.
It is, because that's where part of the transition is, that the transitional moments when people are feeling that the institutions and established parties are not really working for them anymore. So they're kind of looking for something different. And then these strongmen, they do their best to discredit existing institutions. And many of them create their own parties. Some, like Trump, he gloms on to the grand old party, the Republicans. But they all do their best to discredit all institutions, all opposition, because the law of the personality cult and autocrats is that only they must be believed, right? All roads must lead to people accepting what they say and distrusting. And also kind of trying to break these horizontal bonds in society with others. And so they want you to turn on each other, it's the us and them you mentioned, and distrust each other and ultimately hate each other and even use violence against each other. And instead, it's the vertical, the crowd and the leader. We still see, if you Google fascism or autocracy, you still see these like leader in the crowd photos from the 1930s, like fascist newsreels. And that depends on you not bonding anymore to your fellow citizens, because half of them have been declared, as enemies of the state.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like being in a narcissistic relationship. A narcissist will come and extract you away from your bonds with your family. So you actually lose touch with what might be normal and support and, the potential feedback to tell you you're with an idiot. You shouldn't be with this guy.
True.
So, what I'd love to do, and I've heard you do this on a couple of podcasts and you're so good at it, I might just rattle off a couple of observations that I think a lot of listeners or viewers would have picked up on with the Trump administration that are sort of unfathomable. If you're an intelligent person walking around this planet, it's really hard to work it out. But through the Strongman thesis, I think we're able to kind of see what's going on. So the first thing that comes to mind is, why start a war with Iran when, in fact, you came to power saying you wouldn't be doing such a thing? And what's this very cozy relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu all about? Like, why are we fighting his wars? When I say we, I'm sort of talking about the global West.
So there's a time, one of the things about this autocratic backfire I mentioned before is that when they're getting into a mess at home, or they're trying to escape elections, which is Netanyahu's, because he came into office when he was under investigation, Netanyahu. And the reason
that's a point you make, that's a point you often make, is that a lot of these leaders, these fascist leaders, have criminal charges loitering in the background, like many of them, which would normally make somebody avoid going into the public eye, for a bit. But instead they go in thinking, well, I'm just going to get rid of the legal system. That's one way of avoiding charges.
It's a totally different mentality. Because most politicians, if you have like charges against you or investigation for corruption, you don't want to run for office because people are going to poke around, journalists. But that's not how these guys are built. They are compelled to run for office because they've got to get into power. And so what Netanyahu, we're using him as an example, but he's certainly not alone. He got into power by also allying for the first time with really far-right people like Ben-Gvir and extremists. So he gets into power. And what does he do? He immediately tries to have judicial reform, was what he called it, which was actually trying to fix the judiciary so that he couldn't be investigated for corruption. And so the other thing they do is they will either start wars or they will prolong a war. So continuing with the Israeli case, of course, they've always been at war with Gaza. That's like a through line. But October 7th, they responded to this horrible tragedy. But then he prolonged the war to this day, and then, of course, started the test strikes on Iran in 2025, and now He
Clever
needed
man.
to be at war because then you don't have to have elections, then you can justify emergency measures. And even the former head of Mossad has been very vocal at saying, you got to stop this war, but he can't. He's compelled to have this war. And so, lo and behold, we see Trump deciding to do what no American president has ever done and attack Iran, which was at the behest also of Netanyahu. But it suited Trump to be at war. It's just that he didn't plan it properly because he has a lot of incompetence in an office, and he also thought it was maybe going to be like Venezuela. You go in there, you get rid of the head of state, and it all goes away. Well, that's not right. And so you have this really complete incompetence. But he needs to keep the war going, because if he stops, then he thinks he's going to lose something. And by the time they wake up to realize that the war is actually going to take them down, it's sometimes too late.
You mentioned, yeah, exactly. I mean, and the real fatal error here is he didn't go into it with a propaganda, with a narrative, that he could go, and that's the autocratic, what is it, backfiring. Just didn't think it through. Yeah, and he could have actually done this if he'd brought his MAGA base along with some kind of, strongman story. You mentioned the incompetence. His administration is comically incompetent. With all kinds of dodgy backgrounds and weird memes of being topless in saunas with Kid Rock. And I mean, it'd be funny if it just wasn't so tragic at the same time. What is the deal with surrounding yourself with people who are not able to do their jobs? I mean, that would seem to be a strange way to go.
Yeah, I wrote a couple of pieces, one in my Substack Lucid in, I think it was December 2024. So they hadn't even started officially yet. And a New York Times op-ed that came out at the end of January 2025. And one was about Pete Hegseth and one was about Tulsi Gabbard. And they both argued that that often autocrats will they will create cabinet positions and staff them with people who are inexperienced or incompetent or just professionally not or personally unqualified. And that way, the autocrat can keep his power over them. Because, for example, in intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, you have, like, especially because it's intelligence, you have to have your own networks. Also, foreign networks are very important. Trust, you have to have the trust of foreign partners in intelligence. She didn't have any of that. She was totally over her head. And that was, so she was put there on purpose, because then she could be his kind of lackey, and she wouldn't have any independent power base. And when autocrats get, it can even happen that, like, autocrats have been there a long time. If they get more paranoid, like Xi Jinping, he's been firing like half the military, and he's been firing these high officials who've been there for years, who have a lot of independent power base, and they don't want that anymore. But in Trump's case, he started out like this. So he puts Pete Hegseth, who had no qualifications to run the giant U.S. military. But they're loyalists. They will do anything that he says. And in Hegseth's case, they're white Christian nationalists. And he sees he's an advocate of holy war. And so that fits also with it fits with Netanyahu wanting to have this messianic ideology about the Holy Land. And so Hegseth is Trump's opening to the Christian nationalists too. So it all fits together, but it fits in a way that you don't, it doesn't make sense according to democracies. These people are not there because of qualities that we would associate with competence in a democracy. So I always try and shift people's mentality to say, well, guess what? The criteria are totally different for autocracy.
Yeah, you really do have to let go of your normal human ideas of how things should be done. And I sit around and I listen to people getting really upset about politics. And I sort of say, well, listen, politics has never been an absolute reflection of our moral base. We have to actually make the politicians work for us. And at times in history, they really go off piste, working to a completely different kind of way of going about life. You mentioned the God element, the Christian element, the fundamentalist Christian element here. I mean, that is something, particularly for Australians and the English, it's always been an element of that in American politics. It's really not present in our politics, not to the same extent, for sure. And I'm just wondering if this is a big question, but I'm wondering where the God stuff, the full-on sort of the rapture, evangelical, second coming of Jesus kind of thing, but also the techno-fascists, the billionaires, and the media barons. There's this kind of weird intersectional thing going on. Peter Thiel being at the centre of a lot of this, And then you've got this weird thread with people like Curtis Yarvin and Mark Andreessen, all of whom are sort of advising one way or another to the Trump administration with a connection to Peter Thiel. And they've got these feudalist manifestos where they've got this idea that it's going to be a tech CEO that comes in and takes over America / the world. But all of these people are all hanging out together. They're all sort of propping each other up. Ruth, are they in a room kind of constructing a coherent conspiracy against us all? Or is it as kind of shambolic as it sounds?
I think it's a bit of both. I think they feel a bit some of them on the defensive right now, because it's really interesting. Alex Karp, the Palantir, which has huge contracts in the U.S., the CEO of Palantir, which is deeply involved with our ICE. They want to have this kind of database of surveillance. He just released a manifesto, a 22-point manifesto. And you think, well, why is he doing this now? And Elon Musk, the Washington Post did an investigation. He has been, the last months, he has been posting obsessively about race.
Yes,
now,
like he's hundreds of posts.
Hundreds, like almost Trump level of frequency. Because Trump doesn't sleep. That's why he sleeps in the day at his cabinet meetings, because he's rage posting all night.
Exactly.
So Elon Musk is rage posting, but with a obsessive focus. So something is going on where they have decided like it's time to accelerate. So we released the manifesto, and we tried desperately to indoctrinate more and more people with our race theories, that kind of stuff. So I think that they don't all sit in a room and come up with a plan, but they do have this idea of these network states where they would like to have these utopias, these fascist utopias, where they are completely free of any regulation. And they've done pretty well in the U.S., and they have the partner of Trump who's deregulating everything. Right?
Yeah.
And I actually want, often we talk about authoritarianism in like legalistic terms, like you take over the institutions, you destroy the rule of law, and that's part of it. But really, another kind of definition or a description of a process, even more important for understanding these elites and stuff, is it's taking away the rights of the many to allow the very few unheard of freedoms to plunder. And I know you deal in you're a thinker about systems. And so this is the utopia of being able to plunder the workforce, the environment, female bodies, and everything, because regulations have been rolled back or taken away. And so it's getting rid of the rights for the many and giving new freedoms to the very few. And so that's happening in the United States because Trump is allowing it to happen. He invited Musk into government, the Doge stuff, which was a kind of a coup in a way. And I think that the U.S. is an experiment. It's a laboratory right now for allowing people like this unheard of power inside the U.S. government, because Vance, our vice president, is a proxy for Peter Thiel.
Totally. He was totally set up by Peter Thiel. But so was, Doge was a Mark Andreessen baby, so there's that connection there. They're all having a say in this. But yes, sorry, I interrupted.
No, you're right. It's very important. And I do think that the U.S., because of Trump is so venal, he allowed for the first time, so an oligarch. So the point of the oligarch in Russia and Turkey and Hungary before with Orban is that the oligarch is outside of government, and they make an alliance with the autocrats. So like in India with Modi, the oligarch buys up TV stations or banks, and then they become like the partners. But they're outside of government. What Trump did in return for, millions and millions from Musk to help him get elected, he let Musk come inside the government and actually was almost like a co-president in the first months. And I published a lot about this in Lucid. And it was almost like people couldn't quite grasp what was going on. But Time magazine actually had a picture on its cover of Musk behind the desk in the Oval Office, because the guy was acting like a co-president. And this is why I say I think that we are a laboratory right now for rule by oligarch.
And look, it's spreading. I mean, if America is the laboratory, I think it's the experiments rolling out. Australia, a Palantir has arrived here. There's government contracts with the Defence Department. They already have control of passport systems. One of the major supermarket chains has brought in Palantir technology for facial recognition stuff. The same thing's happening in the US. The debate's happening in parts of Europe, although I think Switzerland just banned Palantir?
Yes.
So, there's some slightly more intelligent conversations, mindful conversations happening over there. But part of all of this is the normalization of it. It creeps in slowly and there's this baseline shift. And so I'm here in Australia just at the moment, and I'm witnessing a lot of people they've got no idea what Palantir is, the scope of their power, and that this is a pivotal moment where we need to be very aware of what's going on so that we can resist. Which does bring me to where you're heading at the moment. So at some point, I don't know when it was, probably fairly recently, I think, you decided to write a new book on resistance. And I think you've got a subtitle for it. Let me see if I've got it right. I've got it written down here. Resisting Autocracy, What History Teaches About Fighting Back. Is that still your committed subtitle? Because I know you're only just started writing the book.
Yes. So right now, that's the title and subtitle. Yeah.
Yeah, I tend to change mine around a little bit as I get closer to publication
date. It may
date.
change. Again, I haven't written it yet, but it'll have a lot about the present too, because we are actually living, we keep hearing, and I talk about this all the time because of what I study. We hear about the march of autocracy. We don't hear enough that we are living through a global renaissance of nonviolent protest. There are huge numbers of protests going around. There's even a whole category of Gen Z protests that have toppled, elites and governments. There's something happening in the world where, not all of it is against autocracy. Like if we look at Chile in 2019, they had the biggest protests since the military dictatorship, and they were against economic inequality. So some of it, and this is what you work on too, right? Systems. I think there's a sense, especially in young people, that they're existentially threatened by climate change, climate crisis, and they are taking to the streets in new numbers with new resolve, and so there's whatever I'm going to write will be also about the present, but there are also recurrences and patterns in history, just like there are with the strongman stuff. There are recurrences and patterns about what works. The timing for when does resistance actually help you topple a regime? There are patterns with this stuff too.
Can you talk to that a little bit? I know that you're only just starting out researching all of this, but what are the patterns that we can be mindful of? When is the right time to when do the tipping points occur? What kind of resistance works? I know I've cited the Erica Chenoweth figure many times over. It takes once a community of any sort reaches a point where 3.5% of that community come out in protest against something, that change comes about, which is quite a small figure. So whether it's in a small community, a nation, globally. But what are some other patterns that we could be mindful of in coming years as we start to mobilize, which I think we're going to have to do? I think this is going to be a global mobilization. It's going to be thrust upon us if we don't voluntarily head towards it. But Yeah, talk us through some of the patterns you've observed already.
You do need, there's safety in numbers, but it also needs to be nonviolent. Now, there are times, like such as a foreign occupation, where civil resistance, like we have it in Ukraine, or the biggest resistance I know very well, because I came out of studying Italian history in World War II, was Italy after they got invaded by the Nazis, so they rose up in the resistance. There was the Dutch resistance, all of these places. So that's like if you have a foreign occupier. But civil resistance to get rid of a domestic tyrant, it works much better. And Erica Chenoweth and others have written on this, if it's nonviolent. And one of the reasons is that autocrats they make these bargains with elites, with media elites, with business elites, military, all kinds of elites. And what you want to do as a resistor is encourage something called elite defection. You want these people to defect from power. And that could mean retracting support, or just not praising anymore, or not doing business with them. And so it's very important to try and get to these elites. And there are different ways people do this. But if it's nonviolent, there's a much bigger chance that as it grows to be a truly mass pro-democracy movement, if it's nonviolent, there's a much bigger chance that elites will switch. If it's violent, they don't want anything to do with it, usually. Again, unless there's like a foreign occupation or some other circumstance.
So what would be an example of getting to the elites? Like, what has worked? Because I can imagine, the elites we're talking about today are handing over gold statues to the president, So I know that there's quite a large boycott of brands like Spotify for their engagement with ICE. I think there's quite a number. ChatGPT, people are turning away from that for similar reasons. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, one of the, because often these elites are motivated by profit as well as cowardice, and the way that autocrats actually seal the deals at the beginning with these people is that they say, "I will make you a lot of money. I will arrange things for you," often through neoliberal economics in Chile or deregulation, whatever it is. "I will allow you to plunder. I will allow you to make money. In return, you have to be loyal to me, no matter what I say or do." And that works. So the way to get to these people, though, is to make their profit shrink, and thus the efficacy of consumer boycotts or different kind of boycotts that worked. So early on in Myanmar, when there was the military coup in 2021, it was the resistance in Myanmar. They eventually had to take up arms, but at the very beginning, they had this incredible civil resistance, and it was young people, and they started to make apps that were tracking in live time the businesses that were collaborating with the junta. And they were very effective at getting some of the businesses to stop doing that. In 2 or 3 cases, the businesses stopped collaborating with the junta, and this success was also why the junta cracked down, and then it got transformed, unfortunately, into a civil war, which is still ongoing. So there's a huge potential for boycotts, certainly in the United States, but it's a bit tough. Many people are not political, or they're detached, and they don't see why they should not keep shopping at Amazon or having their Spotify. They have their habits. People don't like to change their habits. So it's kind of up to us to message in such a way that can get people to see the larger ethical and social value of acting now, because the timing is also key.
Yes, I totally agree. We are at that turning point, and we're going to miss the opportunity. Hannah Arendt talks about that, knowing when to actually step into a moment like this. But I think people listening often need to know that the thing that we're talking about actually does work. I know this from being a climate activist for years. They'd be like, "Oh, I don't know, recycling doesn't really work, does it?" And so there's this reticence to put the effort in. But I think with boycotting, I think people are starting to learn that it does have an impact. Scott Galloway on Pivot, I know you've been a guest on Pivot once or twice before. He actually led a really responsible campaign to get people to unplug from some of these apps, and was able to explain how and why it worked. Each week he was updating it was ChatGPT, wasn't it? Where it was on the stock market. Like, it was taking a hit, and that's enough to make people go, all right, I'm going to do all of this. I read that you wrote in the New York Times recently, this is a quote from, I think, one of your op-eds. There's one reason resistance will continue to spread in the coming years. Dictatorships are not built to navigate a future in which survival of climate change, disasters, resource scarcity, a shrinking labour force, and armed conflict will require fact-based communications, community care, altruism, and other things such states work hard to suppress. And you mentioned autocratic backfire a moment ago, but is this part of the resistance? Is this part of the tactic of resistance? Is actually holding on to democratic values, our humanness, our moral groundedness, and sort of almost wait out what happens with some of these dictators? Like, they wind up shooting themselves in the foot. And what we need to do is ensure that we just hold tight, we hold firm, we don't let those moral values sort of get swept up in it all. Is that part of all of this, do you think?
It is, but I think that just holding out is too passive. I think that what I've been talking about a lot recently is it's not going to be enough just to take the United States, because people are like, what do we do when this nightmare is over? Right? Well, it's not enough to just reform the institutions. People, of course we're going to do that. Because what has happened, I'm just going to, again, it happened under fascism in Italy, it happened in Chile, but I'll just use these states as an example. Trump has been there for 10 years, like a Pied Piper of malevolence, re-educating people emotionally to be suspicious of each other and praising violence as something positive. So he wants to destroy empathy, kindness, solidarity, unity, all of these democratic civil society values. He's actively been propagandizing at his rallies. I have a whole list of quotes from 2015, 2016, 2017. And then he had January 6th, where he told the mob who just, this violent mob, he told them he loved them. And he loved them because they were violent. So we've had all of this. So it's not going to be enough to just hold on and quietly, believe in these values. I really think that we need a kind of campaign of not moralistic, but values renaissance, like a renewal, a moral renewal, where we have to actively counter message and revive, depending how far your society is down the path, these values, and talk about love and talk about humanity, because dehumanization is not just a rhetorical thing. It's getting people to see others as less than human, or just as targets. And so I think we have to be quite active. And I'm working with the Reverend Barber, who's very big on this. And I'm working with some churches. I'm working with other kinds of civil society groups to kind of, a lot of the book is going to be about this, the necessity of a kind of moral renewal, because reforming institutions is not enough.
Yeah. I'm glad you say that. And because I have spoken to different people in this realm who critique fascism, but there's not a real discussion about, well, what comes next? Because a lot of the institutions, a lot of the values that hold up this is society that serves humanity, they're going to be destroyed. Now, we don't necessarily want to go back to those institutions either. There is actually an opportunity to build something that will be extremely human-led, that will be extremely grounded in sort of the morals that have worked for humans throughout history. So to your mind, what could it look like? You've already sort of touched on the fact that you're working with these religious groups, community groups. You say that, we need to sort of revive notions of love. And there's some other terms, I'm just having a look here, these are terms I've picked up from some of your Lucid columns, visible acts of dignity, which is a lovely phrase. So maybe you could just talk, and truth-telling is the other one. Could you talk us through what this could look like? And also, is it going to be something that's going to be top down, or do you feel that this is going to be an emergent hive mind, community led kind of renaissance / resistance?
Yeah, I think the latter. I mean, hopefully the latter. And then, there's this really good book by Eddie Glaude called "We Are the Leaders We've Been Waiting For." I hope I'm not misquoting the title, but there's a big
I think that's right. I know it.
Yeah, there's a big discussion now about leadership, like where does leadership reside? And we're seeing leadership, like in Minneapolis, the spontaneous mobilization of these networks of assistance, where people were, like thousands of people were coming out for community training to help each other. Right when ICE was becoming more and more brutal after it started killing people execution style. That didn't stop people from coming out and in greater numbers and helping people. So that we have lessons that we have had during this time in the United States of people doing enormous acts of love and dignity and community-led things. So I think it has to come from the community up, but the pipeline could be we need to elect leaders who are going to consciously, commit to those values. And then we could change the political class. And that's happening in certain places. It's hard to renew a political class, but I really believe that has to happen. It can't only be community, or else our representation and our laws can't get changed.
And people lose their momentum, right? They lose their enthusiasm and confidence. I think you write about this. A lot of confidence has been lost in the values that hold up democracy and human-led communities. And so there's a restoration of that needs to be done. I know myself, but I know a lot of people listening to this get a little bit frustrated. Yes, but how is this going to scale? How, and also we're coming up against, despotic leaders. Michelle Obama said, when they go low, we go high. It's, I know some Democrats are talking about, well, when they go low, let's go low. Gavin Newsom, with his sort of comedy decided to take that or experiment with that tact. What do you feel, maybe referencing history, tends to work? How can we remain faithful to this? Because I think intuitively we know this is the direction to go into. And I know that when people start to operate this way, it's contagious because it is actually part of our nature. We're actually working in congruence with who we are. So it actually becomes quite an easy thing to do once we get the groove and once we have leaders who kind of encourage it a little. But how do we kind of get there? Because we're a long way back from the starting blocks at the moment, and we've got these despotic leaders in place. Obviously, they're going to backfire. And I love that you put that message out there. I actually find it incredibly hopeful that, they are going to collapse in on themselves. I say the same about AI. I say the same about a whole range of things. This neoliberal system that's no longer serving us is going to collapse in on itself. So we don't actually have to do that work now. But yeah, what can we tell people to help them step up into this and have faith in it?
Yeah, I agree. Before I get to that, we often, and we see certainly so many examples of states that become brutal or genocidal or ethnic cleansing. And so we know that brutality is part of autocracy. But I've been thinking about and starting to talk about another side of it, which is also tragic, that because autocrats don't care about public welfare, and when COVID was going on, I did a radio show and I said, Trump doesn't care if you live or die. And people their heads exploded. They didn't like that at all. It was too bleak, but it's true. And the thing is, because they don't care about their people, the state is also absent. And I have a line in Strongmen, which is the strongman is at his worst when his people need him the most. They're absent. And so in our country, they've FEMA, the disaster relief, it's been practically defunded. So if you have climate or other caused natural disasters, the state's not going to help you, because why should we help you? We're neoliberal, autocrats. We don't care about you. So that's going to become more evident. And that's very scary, that the state will be absent and actively uncaring as well as brutal. So I think people will
Yeah.
wake up. I think there's
But
going to
it's going to be really hard, right? So we're not going
really
to be able
hard.
to lean on the structures
That's
that
right.
have been there in the past to support us. We're going to be in a pretty raw place when we are forced to really step up and resist.
I agree. But here I feel that we should never give up on elections, and go back to the point we were making before, that resistance is actually a way, if you study resistance movements, they are actually kind of laboratories of new ways of communicating. Like, there's been a lot of interesting public art and performance things to do with that come out of resistance movements. You also get new leaders who come out of social movements and resistance movements. And the other thing that's happened in our country is that the two largest resistance movements in U.S. history, first was the Women's March, and second was Black Lives Matter. And both of them had huge electoral consequences. And thousands of women decided to run for office because of the Women's March. They never thought they would run for office. And they're running like locally or statewide or whatever level it was. But thousands of women ran for office, and some of them are in power now. And the same thing happened after Black Lives Matter, where we had people we had kinds of representation we never had before in certain small towns. And this is why the backlash is so brutal right now on behalf of, white male Christianity, because we were really realizing, because of resistance that fueled elections and people voted in larger numbers, we were starting to have representation that looked like a multiracial democracy. So I think we never give up on elections. We never get fatalistic and think elections aren't going to work, because they're crucial to what you're saying to people thinking, well, how is this going to actually change anything?
The other thing that comes out of these moments is incredible thought leaders. You mentioned art, and so on, but philosophies. And I think this is the other thing that we can bear in mind. It can look bleak, but times like this are also moments of great flourishing. The axial age, there's been different periods throughout history, different revolutions produced entirely new social moments, and art movements. And so I think it helps, I know at a personal level, to sort of see all of it in that context. This is what humans do. We go through these big eruptions. It's very hard for people in 2026 to fathom that we're going to have to resist, we're going to have to fight, we're going to have to let go of an old system that previously served us. And we're going to have to, you call it a moral imagination, we're going to have to foster a moral imagination, which is both terrifying but also really, really exciting. Like, it's a blank slate in some ways, when we have the ability to draw on past eras and cherry pick what could actually work. Can I ask, before I ask my final question, are you optimistic? Are you sort of, I guess, actively optimistic about what's ahead for your country, but the world more broadly?
I am, in certain ways. I mean, it's hard. It's harder to be optimistic right now about climate progress because it's actively, yeah. But I really believe that these autocrats are aging out, with a few exceptions like Bukele. They're doing things that backfire, and they are going down. Putin is in terrible trouble. Orban is out. And we're getting, in our country, certainly, we're getting a whole education in what government should be and is not, and what it could be. And so I believe, I am optimistic, that I don't know what the time frame will be, but we will come into something better, and autocracy will be exposed for the kind of murderous, thieving, lying, state of affairs that it is.
Yeah. What about the oligarchs, the tech bros? Are they going to go through a similar sort of backfiring? Do you think? Do you think they're going to eat themselves up? Is AI going to, turn in on itself?
It could. They're so entrenched in certain, as you were saying before, the systems that they fostered are so entrenched. And think about Starlink, and it will be hard to get rid of them as an economic power, perhaps. But I think that as people wake up to the destruction that autocracies cause, and also the hypocrisy of these billionaires who don't want to pay taxes, I think that their political machinations and designs will be discredited. As hardship spreads, people will have less, they will buy in less to their fantasies, their techno-fascist fantasies.
Yeah. And I also think there's a limit to their growth. There's only so much energy and water and resources they can actually use before they destroy their own systems. Without electricity, they're going to be pretty stuffed. Without an economy, they're going to be stuffed, They can build all the bunkers that they like, but if the system goes down, they're not going to be able to pay for the security guards at the bunkers. There's practicalities like that. Okay, so the final question, Ruth, that I ask of all guests, to try to get an insight into how we be fully human in this, how we maintain our humanness. You're at the front line of all of these discussions. How do you stay sane? How do you cope at a day-to-day level?
I do yoga, and I do a lot of yoga and exercise. But yoga is very, it's just very, because it's a spiritual thing as well as a physical strengthening. I also spend time in nature. And, like a lot of the things, it's about having perspective. And I think that I'm helped being a historian because one of my aim is to kind of give people the big picture thinking. And there's a certain solace in seeing the longer run of things, because autocrats rise and then they fall. And I'm also an optimist about human nature. I'm a humanist. And I think that, one of my slogans is never underestimate the American people. And I'm not saying that out of a naivete and not downplaying all the bad things that have happened here. It's that I think that, as we've seen in places where ICE has been brutalizing people, all the goodness that comes out in moments of crisis and the community spirit. So I am an optimist by nature and in this situation.
Nice. It's interesting how sort of movement and nature just comes up for so many of us. And I don't know if you're the same. I've always naturally, intuitively done that from a very young age. I've done a lot of hiking around the world. And in fact, it's what I do, is just hike. I hike out everything. I write while I'm hiking, that's where I get my ideas. But I feel that as things have dialed up, it's not even a nice to have now. I am aware that if I do not do these things, my heart rate goes up. I can't breathe properly, and I crave it. I'm like, I must do yoga. I must move in nature to be able to really be in this moment. And so, it's a very interesting observation. All the things that the spiritualists have been telling us to do that we're like, oh yeah, it's coming home to roost
now.
Yeah, it does.
Yes, we need it now, and we can remember that the forces that want us to just be fragmented and scrolling on our phones all day, that's not where our deep thoughts and deep feelings are going to be coming from. So I've been also leaving my phone at home when I go out on hikes and things. I don't want to be as connected, so that way I can immerse myself in nature and in spirituality and all of that.
Yeah. And the human entity responds so well and so fast to this. It's almost something of a salve if we can just break that cycle. Hey, thank you so much, Ruth. I really appreciate your work. I can't wait till your book actually comes out. Good luck with writing it in the meantime and being in this information, this hard information.
Thank you so much. It's been lovely to speak.